It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Welcome to The New Next, a podcast that addresses current events and how they will impact the future.
So we had the BRICS summit, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa meet in Johannesburg on August 23rd. So this meeting has been around developing new mechanisms for considering new members. And especially people in the kind of global south. So it's really, we've talked a lot about this transitioning into a bifurcated world between the Western democracies, the NATO-aligned countries, and these commodity producers, maybe the core widget producers that, kind of like in America sometimes, we don't necessarily value the people at the bottom of the system as much as we do on the top. And this has been the situation that these countries have been in a long time. In their determination is that they're used more for their extractive resources or their ability to supply cheaper labor, and not necessarily respected in the way that they believe that they should. So this agreement to add expansion definitely enables the BRIC countries to both use their monetary currencies backed by fundamental materials, oil and gas, agricultural goods, military in China and Russia, and advanced technology, gold, silver, stuff like that, to really provide a very interesting alternative to the historical support that Western democratic countries have provided with their financial system. So one of the things that Putin discussed during this conference, which he attended remotely, was that the de-dollarization of the world is unreversible. And this is one of the things that we talked about on this podcast a few years ago, probably like at least a year ago, was this feeling that financial sanctions would have a lot of unintended consequences. And we've kind of hit this point where they fully realize that, with all the loss that Russia has experienced by being ripped out of the Western democratic financial system, it's forced them to move in a way that's independent and aligned with these, I'd say, more synergistic countries, less on ideology and more on functional needs to run an economy. And with these countries too, they also saw how we could pretty much be removed from their financial situation or the financial system overnight at a huge risk to their country. So you see oil being traded in rupees and in rubles, in yuan, which the petrodollar has always been a huge benefit to the West. It's quite an interesting time. You really have this, I'd say that this is kind of the starting point where these countries are really leaning into this whole new world that they believe and are setting out the formal guidelines and principles to lead to their expansion as a true alternative to Western democratic principles. And like we talk a lot about the fundamental providing of these Maslow's hierarchy of needs. China is very interesting, though, as a member of this, because it's a huge economy, but it's also, some would argue, on the verge of a massive debt crisis driven by real estate. So, if you look at their high yield real estate, pretty much everything is underwater right now. There's Country Garden and multiple other major developers that are basically in default and paying, not paying on their loans. So it's very interesting. Russia is isolated. China is isolated to a sense. But Brazil and India are very tied in with the West. And I don't think that they themselves really want to go down the route that China and Russia and, potentially Iran as a member in here would want to go as a true parallel and replacement for what the United States provides. Despite what we've been through with Bolsonaro, the former president of Brazil, I think there's a lot of stability in that country, and their want and need to be a partner with the United States. And India has its own issues with border complications with China. So it's not just, when you look at, we often like to think about good versus evil, around this superhero concept out here in the West. And a lot of our media, our films, our creative aspect is like, I'm good, you're bad. But it's not really that case. Every country has their own self-interest. We all should want to play in the same sandbox together. And I just don't really think canceling people and canceling countries is really a viable option. So our big concern is that the BRICS New Development Bank, our big concern from the West is that the BRICS New Development Bank is an alternative to basically the Western democratic financial system. And it's kind of this weird point where the Western democratic countries need to step up their game, especially in these poorer countries, if we want to stay as relevant as we have. So we'll see how this turns out. But BRICS are home to 40% of the world's population and a quarter of global GDP. And as they raise from that developing to developed country status, you're going to see the global economy increase. So it's you can only tariff your way out of small problems, but I'm all in favor of global coordination and fair rules, holding people accountable, and enforcing the rules that we have around especially corruption here in the US. So there's got to be rules. You got to enforce things, but it's also difficult seeing these more totalitarian countries slip away in terms of our coordination. And I deal with this whole problem myself, is not establishing clear boundaries at the beginning of a relationship and not standing up to those over times. Problem gets harder and harder. And that's where we found with China, I think globally, is that nobody really wanted to address the situation. And it's been this great economic story too, seeing China move up like they have, but it's also a very, very high tier, low tier place where a lot of people have received a lot of the gains that were in more of this oligarch rule by few group. And there's still a lot of people struggling to survive. So I still believe in the Western democratic system. I still believe in a lot of the fundamental beliefs that we have along our Western democratic guidelines. And I think the best path that the U.S. has is living more true to our beliefs, values, and ideologies in the light of this beautiful, messed up, complicated framework that we have, that the framers of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights gave us, then going more in the direction of these countries. And it's a interesting time in the entire world. And I think that that's been our topic over the past couple of years, and probably the phrase that describes it most. It's interesting. Like if you follow this stuff, if you know global economics and stuff like that, the relationships and visions and values and ideologies between different groups, whether they be religious, economic, or political, we're in such a transition time. And we're also in a time too that this digital economy that we've created is accelerating in a way that is so foreign to our existence over the last 1,500 years that nobody really knows where the world is going. But a lot of people don't trust what they see anymore. And there's a lot of reasons to not trust it, is the corruption associated with our highest leaders and how they continue to lie to us. And it, you know, just in certain particular people that we've talked about this before, where that heads, what the consequences are going to be for that. I think a lot of the people that are more armchair commentators, and you could probably include myself in that too, is that we don't really know these people in the way that we think that we do. It's a perception of sound bites and attacks and framing of political debates. You know, we've been probably a little bit lazy as consumers for information, and it's a very interesting time. And I've already seen examples of this as people online basically using AI as the new Bible. And they're like, well, ChatGPT said this, or Bard said this, and therefore you're wrong. And things are more complex than just an answer out of an AI bot that is often wrong. So, you know, the world's changing. It's changing quickly. And you have these two kind of groups, the groups that are ruled by a few and are overly controlled of their information And I would say the more Democrat, more ruled by the memory, the populace, even though we do have this system where you can buy policy with enough money in the US, frankly, by talking to the right people, buying the right lobbyists with the right relationships that are looked at as subject matter experts. And this isn't necessarily the truth. It's two different groups of people living in two different worlds. And I think if anybody said that they knew exactly where it was going, they'd be lying to you. You know, we've been pretty, I'd say, accurate on our predictions on this podcast, but we've been extremely wrong about things too. And me especially, you know, a great example of that is having Trump withdraw and supporting a insurgent candidate like Kerry Lake. And that's something that I need to go back again and look at. But, you know, sometimes the insurgent candidate in that party, Vivek Ramaswamy, or Vivek, comes up and rises out of it. So there's a lot of these underlying cultural, political, and personal dynamics and energy kind of playing at its in the world today. There's a lot of revolutionary energy, whether that be in the US or Europe or, I mean, globally, that I think people aren't really sure if they can trust what they trusted anymore. There's power in that, but there's also a little frightening nature. And I'd say if, you know, policymakers, politicians are probably the most frightened people that they are in the world today, because both the fortunes of themselves, but the life that they have worked their entire life for, you know, assuming that they're, you know, a good person, could be thrown out overnight by fake news or by just a general distrust of our elected officials. And it's a lot of it's warranted. So we're at this point where who can you trust? And I think that's really demonstrating it in this BRICS versus Western Democratic country to align stuff right now. I'm very critical of a lot of the things that we've done to exert power over countries, especially militarily, in recent years, because it wasn't necessarily that I disagreed that this could be a positive outcome in the long run. It was more the framing of it and what else are you going to lose on these second or third degree tied things that you're never necessarily going to get back. And, you know, the legitimacy, I'd say, at the West is a lot more at stake right now than the legitimacy of the BRICS, because these are economic tied countries, and there's disagreement on how far the bloc's ambitions go from here, especially being pushed back by India and Brazil, and I would assume South Africa too. But our record can be used against us, and it is being used against us, mostly militarily and playing these games behind the scenes, that we really need to be more transparent now, and focus along these democratic values if we want to stay as relevant as I believe that we should and can as a G7 group. And, you know, these people both in the US that believe in this concept of freedom and liberty, as a group of United States that are able to maintain their cultural backbones. I see Europe right now going through a revolution, and it's this push-pull that we went through and we continue to go through. But when you look at branding and marketing and stuff based on the EU, the European Commission, they're really focused on this United States of Europe. And I think that's a great thing. I think independence is good. Independence for Europe is good too, because it allows them to distance themselves from a complicated history in the last 30 years for America. But I don't know how this thing is going to turn out. I just understand how much power there is in the BRIC countries to literally shut off core components that we need to have an operating economy. And Taiwan is just sitting out there too, as being this element where the US economy is just totally dependent on semiconductors out of Taiwan. What happens? Will it be 2025 when the Chinese military feels that they're strong enough to invade it, as has been talked about before? What happens when the BRICS or the RC, Russia and China, and, substitute India and put Iran in there? Russia, China, Iran. Those are three of the largest standing armies in the world, extremely well trained. They know how to fight. They've experienced fighting, especially Russia, from a strategic sense, in what they've done since 2010 in having real tactical warfare fights. It's not necessarily a great time. We'll see where it goes, but a potential world war, like a true world war, could really shake up everything. And that's where overnight you make decisions. Are you with me or against me? Not something I want to see, but a viable future that we should all be aware about and be watching it occur in the background.